Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
The environment, by its very nature, is unified, with every part impacting the whole. Yet in our study and understanding of it, we tend to break it down into parts such as botany, zoology, geology, and so on. Does this fragmented approach have us missing something vital? After all, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you around the world on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, xzbn.net. With us this hour to delve into intersectional environmentalism is Isaias Hernandez. Isaias has a BS in environmental science from the University of California, Berkeley, and spent his college years working on a variety of diversity inclusion work in environmental spaces, academic research, and creative work. Mr. Hernandez is an environmental justice activist and educator. His website, queerbrownvegan.com. Isaias, thanks so much for joining us on Mission Evolution.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Gwilda.
Yeah, we tried to do this a while back and then had tech difficulties, so I'm glad we're going to pull it together today.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, when did you first become interested in environmental issues?
Yeah, I love this question so much. So I think growing up in Los Angeles, my parents had immigrated from Mexico, and growing up in LA in a poor neighborhood, I realized I had lack of access to resources. So one of those very evident things that I saw growing up is my apartment was right next to the railroad where freight trains would pass every day at 5 a.m. So I'd get awakened up by then. That was my natural school alarm, I always tell people. And, for my majority of my life, I always wondered that, why is it that, people that look like me don't have the same amount of resources when I go to different communities in Los Angeles? And you can tell from, higher affluent income zip codes in the United States that they have more access to green spaces, they have fresh air, more access to clean water, and just abundance of green spaces. And so I think for me, the curiosity kind of started when I watched Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. I was in middle school and obviously had come out back in the early 2000s. And I was just very fascinated by the term global warming. And I just was really confused of like, what does that really mean? And I remember very clearly it said that the benefits of global warming would be happier cows and fresh pastures for animals to graze on. And I said, well, that's a great thing for the animals, right? And I was totally wrong when I looked more into the research and science. And so I think being able to be curious as a young kid really got me to where I'm at today, being able to pursue environmental science and trained as an environmental scientist. And that just came from the fact of wanting to ask questions versus trying to be angry or be sad or confused around this. I think I had to really understand what it means to really understand the climate crisis today that we have.
So, have you seen these issues progress since you first became involved with environmental um, meta- mentalism? Environmentalism, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when we talk about extreme weather changes, there is no doubt that whether people agree or not of the phenomenon or the incidence of climate crisis, everyone can agree that yes, summers have gotten hotter. Some people will say it's always hot during the summer, which is true. It's a season, right? During the summer, you're expected to have higher temperatures. But when you're looking at the global average mean temperatures of throughout the years, we could see sudden increases. And one of those evident things that I see, right, and where I grew up in my neighborhood is that I grew up where the highest it would get during the summers was maybe late 90s or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. I know that we use Fahrenheit here in the States, a little bit different from others. And I remember now my parents have to use the AC. We didn't grow up using the AC. My parents were totally against it because they were like, they don't want to pay more for the electricity bill. And two, it's like a waste of resources that they would set. But now it's so unbearable in the summers that they have to use it almost every day. And so when we look at it through a more different angle, like we have to look at it through the energy costs. More and more Americans and even people globally are spending more money on energy bills because they simply cannot afford it. And it's no longer enough to say set your thermostat at 73 when you're living in an environment that's going to reach 100 plus degrees Fahrenheit. And so more and more, I think those are some of the sudden changes that I've seen, but also the biodiversity loss is very evident in wildfires. Obviously, we know that sometimes wildfires can be caused by individuals that are arsonists or pyromaniacs, but we also need to note that the loss of wildlife species due to the increase of severe drought has led to the severity of these wildfires. That's leading more pressure on it. And the last thing I would just say is that when you look at insurance companies, they are no longer insuring homes in areas that are known to have high rates of environmental disasters, whether that's flooding, wildfire seasons, tornadoes. So more and more, we're taking note that if these companies are not insuring homes, how are people supposed to be living in their homes with safety?
Yeah, it's scary to me what's excluded. It's like if I live in an earthquake area, I'm going to want earthquake coverage. I don't mind
Yeah.
paying for that, understanding that it's more likely, but we need to have it covered. And yet now, I live in a wildfire area, and a lot of people around me can't get wildfire insurance. I was kind of grandmothered in, if you will, but it's scary. I mean, what do you have insurance for if it's not going to cover the thing that's most likely to hit you?
Absolutely, and this is the issue with insurance companies today is that their original missions have always come from this ideology of protecting its citizen, but many of these large monopolies of insurance companies today are no longer guaranteeing a safety net. And the issue with that, right, with the climate crisis, is that with any development of new projects like fossil fuels, insurance companies are the ones that have to approve it. So you need to have insurance for any company that's trying to build something to do that. Now, while these insurance companies are handing out all these licensings and these approvals for these new gas and oil projects, they are also turning back on its customers and saying, "No, we can't give you insurance in this area because it might be bad for us." And so when we're seeing that more of these companies are gearing their profits and their safety protections over these companies versus its customers, there's this lack of sense of morality, but also trust to its general citizen of like, what does it mean to be insured in an overheating future where my home where I want to buy now, I need to consider if it's going to be in a disaster zone and whether or not it's actually worth it to buy a home there.
And the thing of it is, we don't have any way of knowing where the next disaster zone is going to be, do we? I mean, with all these changes.
Exactly. No, we don't know. We do know that for in fact that as regions are going to get more drier and there's more droughts and more prolonged different differences in different seasons, we can tell a map that certain parts of areas due to high amounts of water drought are going to experience high amounts of wildfires. If you look towards the Middle West and the Midwest in the United States, like Minnesota region and like Chicago, they're labeled now as climate refuge states, and climate refuge states are basically areas or environments where with the extreme amounts of temperatures rising in our changing environment, that they are more likely to be resilient to kind of manage or mitigate some of those effects. And that's only because of their proximity and their access to fresh water. Canada, right, has a lot of fresh water and lakes everywhere. That's what it's known for. And the Midwest is kind of similar for that, as water is becoming a more precious and natural resource for our communities.
And then there's the living on the coast issue. Okay, what's more beautiful than opening your window and listening to the ocean all night until it's not so fun because here comes the global warming. The waters are rising. The weather is getting more increment, and all of a sudden it's not you're not safe there like you used to be. And yet there's all these homes and all these people, and all of a sudden they can't get insured. So it looks like a huge problem to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of those policies to help mitigate that in the United States is, for one, to ensure that these insurance companies are actually being held accountable by its people by promising to its customers that it's no longer investing in some of these developmental projects. But the second thing is to make sure that those insurance rates stay the same. And stay stagnant because one of the biggest issues, right, even though people are insured, insurance rates continue to rise every year. And so that puts in for different people that are signing up for insurance recently, or those who have been locked in for a time amounts of years for their previous contracts. Some of those contracts are already expiring, or they're going to have to be renewed. So how do we make sure that these companies are listening? There are a lot of other companies out there that are creating insurance companies based on climate policies and climate safety. I don't know the names, but I'm not going to shout them out here. But I do know that there's a lot of other insurance companies out there that are trying to redesign that system for a healthier and happy society.
Well, I know that one of the problems they've been facing ever since COVID is the cost of materials for a rebuild. Okay, if you have replacement insurance has gone up, so somebody has to eat that somewhere, and it looks like the insurance company thinks the homeowners are the ones, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the issue with, right, when we look at it through a global supply chain issue, is that all the natural resources have gone up since the pandemic. Obviously, one we can say is like inflation and, monopoly greed. But the second thing we can talk more about is how finite these resources are. So when we have more privatization of these certain natural resources that are in different countries, typically in the global south, that are then sourced to us in the global north. Obviously that's a price point there, but two, how sustainable is this methodology? New buildings today, right, have to follow these different new codes, and specifically in materials. And one of the biggest issues that we have in the building industry is that we can't really upcycle a lot of the materials that are used. So like
Well, we're going to have to take a commercial break. Isaiah and I will return very shortly, so don't you go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. When you dissect a frog, is it still a frog, or has it lost some of its frogginess? With us this hour discussing intersectional environmentalism is environmental justice activist Isaias Hernandez. His website, queerbrownvegan.com. Isaias, what is intersectional environmentalism?
Yeah, absolutely. So, intersectional environmentalism is a more inclusive way to look at environmentalism that is a form that advocates for the people on the planet. So, when we typically think about environmentalism, we often think about long settler environmental conservation leaders, whether that's John Muir, Aldo Leopold, and so on, right? And these are very typically big conservationists that have been known in the United States for a lot of the establishments of certain conservation policies, or the ways that America society has started to view conservation. Now, the issue around environmentalism, right, is in its past is that it has not done a really good job in establishing the well-established relationships that many indigenous communities had worldwide. And, some of these authors have even conservationists have even seen these indigenous people as using slurs around them. And so when we uncover the history around environmentalism, one of the popular things that I like to talk about here in the United States is looking at the 1960s and 70s Earth movement. Typically, it was noted that many of these environmentalists and people that were involved are typically upper middle class white environmentalists. Now, that's not the issue about the race. What was the issue is that some of the policies, when they were brought around clean air, clean water, access to clean homes that were removed from toxins that typically Black, indigenous, people of color, or people in poverty or rural areas were living in, were exposed to these types of things. However, it wasn't really an attractive way to build a coalition or to get people invested. Now, when we look back at what was happening during that time, we have to talk about segregation. We have to talk about redlining. And so with redlining is one of those examples where a lot of people that were coming from World War II veterans, they were trying to buy homes, and they were promised by the government and the banking agencies and the city governments that they would let them buy homes. However, a lot of these veterans that were, marginalized people were unable to buy certain homes and certain properties because they were segregated off for only white neighborhoods. And so what happened is that these communities then ended up having to move into these, rural areas or other areas that were already environmentally contaminated by a lot of industries. And there's this conversation of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And it's like, what came first, the poor person or the toxic industry? And in reality, no human being should be living in a toxic environment, right? And I think it is very unique to understand that intersectional environmentalism is a more inclusive way to talk about it. And it was coined by Leah Thomas, a Black environmentalist, to really describe her experience as never really feeling a part of the community, even though she studied environmental science, she did research, she worked with all these communities, but still felt that there was a lack of acknowledgement of how do we talk about race and history in a way that it helps us illustrate us to make us a better environmentalist. And so that's something that I always preach on.
So the problem is pretty many faceted, isn't it? Because we have designed our entire way of life around unhealthy practices. How do you see turning that around, regardless of the color and the place where we're living?
Yeah, I love this question. I think we need to really deconstruct uniformity mindsets that really uphold monocultural values. So, like, one of the most easiest ways I tell people is like, in America, we are very obsessed with green lawns, straight, clear cut lawns. And I tell people, waste of water resources. You could save money by getting rid of your grass lawn, which is something that's very appealable for a lot of Americans when you save money. And the third thing is to promote diversity of flourishing. So changing your own ecosystem very easily. If you're someone with a house and wanting to develop a garden in your backyard, building a compost, really developing these types of local systems is a really huge way to really promote a more ecologically well-being. When we talk about a well-being economic system, one of those like really funniest examples that is used is like Finland, right? Finland is noted to be one of the most happiest places on the world. And I have friends who are from Finland and they kind of laugh at me when they hear that factoid because they said, you know, it's, I guess it's true to a certain extent, right? Because their government invests in the people, they invest in these community public resources. So I think when we're looking at it through a policy side, right? How do we make sure that public service systems in America are actually serving people, like free lunches for kids? I'm for that because that's my tax dollars that is going to fund the next generation. You know, public libraries, you know, funding libraries should not be political. It should be a part of a free, open access knowledge. And I would say the last thing too for people to really promote this earth well-being society is know your neighbor. It's been reported that when you don't know your neighbor, you're more likely to feel isolated, but you're also less likely to survive an emergency. And that cannot just be a climate disaster. It could be some type of like health emergency. And it's been found that when you know your neighbor, your chances of survival and your chances of safety increases. And I think we've become a bit polarized and a bit separated from, you know, our individuals and our societies. That how do we make sure that younger generations are making sure to greet the person down the street, say hi to the cashier, thank
Well,
your registry person.
well, Isaiah, they have to put down the phone first.
Yeah, yeah.
So it seems like the thing that hooks us together supposedly is actually segregating us. I wanted to ask you, one of the major issues is farming practices, right? And it'd be lovely to go back to the indigenous ways, but there's way too many of us on the planet now. Is there a third option for the way we're growing our food?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think when we talk about the globalized food system, there are really strong cases of arguments for it to exist because we do, like you said, we have a large population. Most Americans and most Canadians too source their food at a grocery store. Not a lot of us go to farmers markets to source locally. Well, we wish we could do that. That would be amazing. But I do think that when it comes to looking at specific industries, one of those largest emitters is meat and dairy. Not only is meat and dairy, right, large amounts of emissions coming from, you know, it's not coming from cow burps, coming from cow farts, methane emissions. They contribute a large degradation to soil erosion, to water erosion, and also air pollution. So if we're looking at these industries one by one, is that I don't think I'm advocating to take Americans' meat or access to, you know, their dairy away. What I'm saying is that we've given them so much subsidies for them to continue to exist. And the surplus amount of waste that is generated from this industry and the amount of listeria outbreaks and other salmonella poisoning that's happening with these products, it needs to be downsized. It needs to be reduced. It needs to be reintegrated. I think that there's industries like here in California where we produce 1/3 of the world's, I think the U.S. food supply system is almond farm. So I talked to actually almond farmers and I did a project with them this year where they talked about how, almonds get really bad raps because they used to say that they used to flood their orchards back in the 1970s and 80s because they thought flooding them was the best way. Now, through sustainability practices and working to form a sustainability board, they found micro irrigation to not just reduce water usage, but to reduce it to at least 30%. And an additional 10% was found the last 10 years with the existing technology. So I think that the technology sector plays a huge role in making sure that the ways that we're using these resources in our globalized food system can really reduce the emissions. But I think that when we're talking about destroying the industry, I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. I do think
Oh,
that there's policies we can do.
yeah, we might get pretty hungry if we try to destroy it altogether. And
Yeah.
then there's also this time period between when the old is the majority and moving in with something more sustainable. That shifting time is very, very volatile, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is. And I think, when we look at these traditional practices, like the older practices that the industries use, we have to remember a lot of them use models of economic GDP output. So, like, if we're looking, for example, like at forestry, for example, and I remember learning this in a class, is that they use these outdated models that talk about the optimal sustainable yield. It's like how much can we cut down a forest before it collapses. So they find this equation, right? They use the ecological math and data and whatever. But, we have to recognize that our environments have changed from that. So if we're still using data sets or trying to use our experiences of how good the soil was 20 years ago, 10 years ago to what it is now, that's where it's dangerous. So I think updating those models to understand the quality of the soil levels everywhere and in the countries to make sure that food is still going to be produced, because we still waste a lot of food every year. I mean, it's a huge issue in America that it's such a shame that we see grocery stores throwing out food that they can't sell, and rather than giving it away, it's more profitable for them to destroy or throw it to the trash bin.
Yeah, it's sad. And there's so many ways, particularly in a semi-rural area like Safeway here. If I go into Safeway and they'll give me their, produce that they can't sell, and I'll give it to my neighbor for chicken eggs. Okay, it feeds the chickens and the pigs. But when you're in a city, you don't really have that option. What would be an alternative?
Yeah, I think that when, people in predominantly rural or like economically deprived areas are limited access to that, one is obviously what I've advocated from an individual lifestyle, right? Is growing your own microgreens. Regrowing vegetables is a huge thing. I mean, I regrow my green onions, just put it in a cup of water and they regrow, right? These are things that are based on survivable, but they're not based on realistic things of going to nourish your body for the rest of the season. So I tell people that in order to kind of sustain themselves is like really working together with community to make sure that local food banks are being organized, or working with local grocery stores to see if they have a discounted aisle where they sell produce.
Hmm.
I know that this was common growing up in my neighborhood, even though I live in an urban area where, the store would have a discounted aisle, but it's like, we're going to throw it away, but it's discounted. So we can
Well,
buy it at a cheaper price.
is that magic moment again? We're going to have another station break. Isaiah and I will be right back to continue our discussion. Please stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Are we really in an environmental crisis, or is denial just a river in Egypt? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing the environment when viewed as a whole is Isaias Hernandez. His website, queerbrownvegan.com. Isaias, we've started mentioning that the guides that we had for being sustainable um, are archaic because our environment is changing so rapidly with global warming and everything else. What would you say is the part of a change that is impacting us most at this time?
Yeah, I think that the change that's affecting us most right now is the high cost of living everywhere. Materials and sources, as we mentioned, due to massive biodiversity loss that's happening worldwide. Our global supply chains are increasing in terms of like their intensity to extract the resources. So, you know, typically in America, and this is more America, it's like we have to pay for our health insurance. Health insurance is becoming more privatized. Equipment and materials are becoming more resourceful to do that. The cost of living, it's really hard to buy a home these days. Materials cost so much if you want to buy a home, or even if you want to build a home. It's not realistic for young people these days. And I can talk about all these points, but I think that for me, we have to look more about the larger thing of like how this economic system has been designed. And it's been very designed through a linear model of extraction, raw materials, produce, sell, out to the landfill. How do we create an economy that's more circular? And so for me, when we talk about circular economies, it can be very scary for a lot of people because that means that you may take something away from them. But instead of actually framing it that way, it's actually framing it as a way of like, how do we use these resources more sustainably and responsibly to make sure that not only your family is protected, but the family after you, your next generation of kids are protected. And so when we reframe it that way, I think that there's more of this understanding that everyone is in this planet. This is all our homes, and this is a very scary thing to experience. But there's a lot of ways in which, other countries and other cities have already been designing circular economies, whether that's through different industries that we consume, from fashion, media, technology, and other things.
What do you mean by circular?
Yeah, circular is a more like, oval shape. So like typically like when we think about the ways that we get our items, right? Let's talk about the grocery store, for example. Someone grows your potatoes, that laborer does the work to do it. They then put it to a truck. That truck is shipped hundreds of miles to your grocery store. Then it's unloaded and then you purchase it. What a circular economy is more saying is like, okay, what if we actually don't sell that much and actually cut the distance in half? So let's say, oh, well, why can't we sell it locally here in this area that's within 10-15 mile radius of the city? Or why don't we actually make sure that we're only growing certain amounts of produce during certain seasons? Like there's no like why do we have avocados all around season nowadays? Back then it was like they were expensive during season. So I think really readjusting to those prices and restructuring those systems could really help on that end, but also help the consumer.
Well, there's also a lot of talk about empty harvest in that the earth where we farm has been basically stripped of a lot of nutrients by our farming practices. Um, and if we have an empty harvest, that means we're having to eat more to get what we need to sustain us. So, is there some way, or have you been looking into how can we circumvent to where we aren't getting fed chemicals, we aren't being fed from ground that has no nutrients to put into the plant itself? There's all sorts of deficiencies developing as a result. How do we shift this? How do we encourage that?
Yeah, so I think from a policy more global level with our governments is pushing for policies that advocate for regenerative agriculture, which regenerative agriculture is basically a term to say agriculture that uses all ecological beings. So it uses animals, it uses plants, it uses, fungi, the flora, the fauna, but it doesn't use heavy amounts of insecticides, fungicides that typically have large concerns over its degradation towards soil environment. And the next thing I would say that for people that trying to make sure like well, my soil levels are going down, is growing your own compost. I always say this really great example is that I built my own slow compost outside, which I use that compost into soil to grow my garden. So I grew watermelons, I grew sunflower seeds, I grew onions, like I grew strawberries, all of these things, just by making sure that every produce I ate was composted naturally. I think a lot of people think that you need to do all these like insane things of worms and everything. I did the slow compost method of just using dry leaves, food, only fruits and vegetables. You can't put meat or fish into compost. I don't think maybe it does compost, but I've heard it doesn't. So I don't know about that. But, being able to build my own compost has really built a lot of more agency for me to understanding why we should protect our soil. I think when humans are given tasks to do and recognize having to take care of it, they're more inclined to protect it. And so I think we have to also ban subsidies from larger industries that are using these types of chemicals, right? Because we're giving them so much money, and it does not make any sense for the American people that we are using that. And also, the third thing I would just say is banning other foreign countries from buying land or using our resources, because there's other countries in America using our natural resources to grow food for their countries that then's being shipped internationally. And I don't think that makes any sense when we should be growing certain produce for animal livestock feed. That's not sustainable in certain environments. Like in Arizona, we're growing alfalfa that's being shipped to Saudi Arabia, which does not make any sense.
Well, probably does to Saudi Arabia. It's pretty barren over there.
Yeah.
Um, the subsidy, I would, is there something in the works to get the subsidy going towards environmentally sound practices versus the typical farming practices?
Yeah, there is the Farm Act, the farm bill that's actually being pushed right now in the United States to make sure one that workers who typically work in these industries that are typically undocumented get paid a fair living wage and have access to pathway to citizenship. But the second thing is more to make sure that these industries like meat and dairy have limited amounts of money and funding that's going to them. Unfortunately, due to lobbyists and these conglomerates of these companies, these are companies that actually have billions of dollars behind them, and they're not willing to obviously lose money for their stakeholders. So I think making sure that we can not ban lobbyists, but to make sure that we can influence lobbyists to think differently, that are not hired by these companies, to make sure that they influence our politicians. Unfortunately, it is true that you can't approach a politician and say, go vegan, right? That's not going to work. They're going to look at you and say you're delusional. But what you can do is actually call your local office and talk to them about, what are the initiatives they want to support? What is it that they're trying to contribute? Because a lot of these politicians serve farming communities. So the best way to do that is by educating and meeting those farming communities and understanding what their needs are. And a lot of them right now are bankrupt because they don't have enough money, and they're already in massive amounts of loans through these companies of having to grow cattle or having to grow chickens and other things like that.
So, one thing that we briefly touched in on is the individual starting to produce some of their own food. Now, a lot of people live in, say, a high-rise apartments, but I've seen where they're using the roof, flat roof, and have growing things in containers. Okay, um, I lived in town quite a while ago, and I had a very small yard, but within that yard, I had a garden, I had a composter, I had chickens, okay, and I was able to produce quite a bit of the food that I needed just in my little postage stamp size yard and still have the yard look nice. Are there any programs out there that are starting to teach people how to do this? Because it's not impossible by any means.
Yeah, this is so good to know. I know that I'm really privileged to live in California. I always say it could be its own country if we left the United States. One of those things is that I love about California has very progressive environmental policy. So we're really known to pushing that. And one of those policies that we're trying to get is to green schools. So like when we green schools, we don't just talk about like, oh, make it eco-friendly. We're actually implementing gardening programs and curriculums for young kids to get invested in the environment. The second thing I would say is that there's a lot of community garden spaces that are being reclaimed. So a lot of communities are coming together to buy plots of lands for the community to have that access to green space and to grow their own gardens. I think that's another way from a just local people to people level. And the other thing is like for people just wanting to learn more is that, I found resources like YouTube to be very beneficial, but also more than everything, I tell people like older people know much more wisdom to be able to teach you a lot because they take care of their lawns really well here in America, the older folks. So I always say like, take note of how they're growing and how they're taking care of their properties, because I do think that when you really meet with someone and talk to them about their practices, you actually are more inclined to adopt that practice.
The elders have been kind of pushed to the wayside, unfortunately, and all of them are great wealth of information, should we choose to listen. But the fact remains that we have way greater numbers now than we did 50 years ago, and the practices that we've developed are not putting nutrition in our food. Um, can we find a way to blend things. We can't go back to the old indigenous ways. There's too many of us, but there's a lot of indigenous ways that we could possibly implement. Have you looked into this at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of, when we talk about traditional ways and the new, quote unquote, new world ways, we have to understand, like, okay, well, if we don't want indigenous led solutions, how do we make them at the forefront? And a lot of that is actually looking at the different ways that companies have started. So, like, there's like a really great company, for example, like called Native Renewables. It's from the Navajo community, and they power indigenous communities with solar power. And
Okay.
that's
Well,
obviously, oh,
we're going to have to power this show with yet another commercial break.
yeah.
But please stay with us as Mr. Hernandez and I continue to explore environmental education and social justice. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. So we're really in an environmental crisis. Now what? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with environmental issues with Isaias Hernandez. His website, queerbrownvegan.com. Isaias, the term environmental crisis sounds like it's an emergency, and I would have to say it probably is. But it sounds like implementing the things that we need to implement to move back to a more sustainable way of growing food, et cetera, is time consuming. I mean, it's, we're way on one end of where we want to be as far as our practices go. How can we get the two of them to blend? How can we move fast enough to have an impact on the environment before it's too late and still be feeding our people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we talk about environmental crisis, I love to use this terminology from my mentor, who's also based in Canada, the term evidence-based hope. So I tell people that when we talk about evidence-based hope, we're looking at factual science and solutions that are happening on the ground. It's easy for us to go on any news site and we're like, we see doom and gloom everywhere. Like, this is burning, Canada's on fire, LA is on fire, this flooding happened, this tsunami happened, and we can get overwhelmed by it, right? But when we actually understand that a lot of the solutions that are happening, whether that's scientists, policymakers, activists, young people creating their own like farmers markets, like, when we seek to find those solutions, we'll realize that that's the thing with hope, is that sometimes we are blind to it. We don't see it because we're so consumed by, like you mentioned too, by sometimes our phones that keep us away from those actual evidence of seeing from our eyes. And so I think that for me, in order to really balance these types of crises that we're facing today, is give and take, right? So, like, understanding that every moment that you breathe in this life is how do you want to give back? And that's the reciprocal relationship that all of us have been taught, like all humans have been taught to be in reciprocity with each other, is that, we don't just, as humans, we don't just like isolate ourselves and, separate ourselves. We help one of each other, we help our neighbors. And so I think in order for us to tackle this crisis is understanding, like, how can we amplify the solutions, the people that are doing the work. And I think a lot of us, right, can be like, I just work a 9 to 5 job, why should I care about the crisis? I'm trying to pay for my kids' health or my education. We don't want to expect everyone to be that environmentalist hugging trees, but we do expect you to understand that if there's solutions happening on the ground, to find them and to ask for them and to demand for them. Ask your city government for them. Ask them, like, what are their plans for it? Because they represent you. You don't represent them.
So, starting at grassroots, if you will, if as many people that can just start a little home garden, that might seem very, very small. But if we think back to the World War II, I believe it was, they had victory gardens. Okay. And they worked really well. And we had pretty good, decent population then. Of course, we have much greater now. How reasonable is it for us to do what they did then and have victory gardens that don't have to be shipped halfway across the continent or the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible to do it. I don't think it's right, like you said, it's not the full solution, it's a part of the solution. So I think that if we're able to reinvest in community gardens, it's a huge appetite for a lot of communities. It's being done here in the United States, where in a lot of communities, like in Detroit, for example, where there's large industries that have left due to, industries being outsourced to different countries. A lot of these communities are typically Black and low income, and these community members have come together to build gardening spaces to feed their people. And I think that's something where we have to acknowledge that there's different conditions and soil levels and qualities have changed over the time. But at the same time, when we take care of the garden together collectively, because having a garden is a lot of work, it takes a lot of time, we can create that type of change.
I really hope we can because, when everybody rallies together, and that was a perfect example of it, the Victory Gardens, when everybody rallies together around this, people are very creative and can come up with solutions you wouldn't dream of as long as we're not sitting in the victim stance, right?
Hmm.
So it's that time in the show when I get to ask you, Isaiah, so what's your mission?
Yeah, my mission is to really provide equitable environmental literacy for people. It's to really make it accessible and culturally significant for a lot of people worldwide, because at the end of the day, education is the stepping tool for us to become better people. And we all have that one teacher who has inspired us to do the work that we do today.
Some of the I think some of the fly in the ointment is that the educational system is designed around passing the tests that are out there, right? It's not designed around what a person really needs to know to get along in the world. They don't teach you how to balance a checkbook. They don't teach you how to garden, and the list goes on and on and on. Do you see programs coming to the fore that could start providing some of that for the children?
Absolutely. I think there's a huge shift for the green economy. And when I mean green economy, it's like, green jobs. So, like, there's a huge investment from governments worldwide that are investing in green technologies or making sure industries are starting to follow more green initiatives. And so, I think for young people specifically, what really excites me is that they are going to be exposed to a new generation of environmental knowledge that I was exposed to as a kid, because as a kid, I was like, I took the school bus, it was powered by gas. And, seeing how schools are now using electric buses, which is pretty cool because I didn't think that could happen. These are all small steps that are being taken, but I think that teachers have a really huge duty to continue making sure next generations of kids are environmentally aware and conscious, because that is their home. And I think the more that we draw those connections, the better.
And by the time they become adults, they have more of the tools to take care of the earth rather than exploit it. That sounds wonderful to me, and I'm seeing a lot of brilliance in the children. My daughter teaches preschool, and she calls it planting roots because she teaches them how to garden from the seed all the way to making spaghetti sauce out of the uh, tomatoes. And if they start that young with the appreciation of the cycle of life, the cycle of growing, isn't that a leg up for all of them?
Yeah, it's totally a leg up. And it's also when you teach kids more interactive experiences on how to take care of living systems or interacting with living materials or the non-living, like clay, sand. These are all textures and things that I was a kid when we were exposed to these types of activities. And obviously it seems like a rarity these days because kids are hooked onto the iPad sometimes. And I think it's really important for us to remember teachers must be funded to create these programs because they're heavily underfunded. They don't get it. They have to sometimes use their own money to buy these supplies.
So, how about again the parents' responsibility? The school can only teach so much. Is there support groups now? I know there is for homeschooling people, but for people just to fill in what they aren't getting in their schooling. Are there some programs now that can help educate parents to educate their children?
Yeah, there's really great resources on YouTube around climate change and education. But the other main source I would say is like there's a Climate for Parents Future. It's like an organization that basically prepares parents to talk about the environmental crisis, but it gives them resources to really navigate. Because I think a lot of parents struggle with trying to deal with their kids that have anxiety over the future of the planet. And this is just like, they have fear of like whether they will have a living home. So I think there's a lot of great resources that exist online that they do today, and also a lot of online group chats that exist.
So, from your viewpoint, okay, what's your vision for the future of our environment with these programs starting to be implemented? What do you see for the future?
Yeah, I see in the future for these programs to be involved and implemented in our governments is One is more accessible transportation through this. Two is like the increase of ecological awareness and education programs where schools are rewilding their own campuses. They're promoting biodiversity. They're creating these sanctuaries for animals and that have homes now that they can live there. And three is like, access to being able to become young scientists. So like making sure that these young people are not just equipped with the creativity and value in mind, but understanding why it's important to record data and science, because data and science actually helps us inform policy and also informs our decision of understanding the issues rather than trying to base it on something that you learned online or you read an article online and it said this. So I think that is something, science literacy is so important.
Absolutely, and understanding the scientific method even. We can apply that anywhere with great results if we're taught how to use it. And it seems to me like we aren't taught how to use that very well in the grade school, high school era.
Yeah, no, we aren't taught that well. I would say that, I have cousins who are asking me for help in terms of like their science classes, and honestly, it's not that they're not inadequate, but it scares me of like how much data and science I was taught as a kid, and that curiosity you had to now it's more like answer the question, you get it right or wrong, and there's no sustenance to that. There's no flavor, there's no storytelling. So I think it's important that when we approach science literacy that we tell a better story to get young people invested in these types of fields.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it seems like the as we educate, either parents doing it or the school system under different guidelines that start to do it, the more any individual is involved within that way not life works on the planet, the healthier we tend to be emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. So I see a win-win, don't you?
Yeah, no, I agree too with that. That they found cities. I mean, there's literally documentaries on media sites that talk about how areas where people have good, well balance of lifestyles have longer lives. So they typically live in areas that are filled with green spaces. They have good social community
Absolutely.
life.
Well, unfortunately, Isaiah's time has flown, but we are out of it.
Yeah,
Thanks so much for coming on the show.
thank you so much for having me.
Our guest this hour has been environmental activist and educator Isaias Hernandez. To find out more about Mr. Hernandez, his works, and teachings, visit his website, queerbrownvegan.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy past archived episodes, visit www.missionevolution.org. But really, the most important thing is join us right here next time. This mission will continue, bringing information, resources, and support to an evolving world.